let's take a look at a classic opening, the Spanish, the Ruy Lopez, and see one particular piece manoeuvre which recurs over and over again, and it's really determined by the pawn structure. So white plays the pawn to e4, black replies pawn to e5, knight f3, attacking the e-pawn, black defends the pawn with knight c6, and the bishop comes to b5. That is the Ruy Lopez. Pawn comes to a6, attacking the bishop, which of course retreats to a4, that's the main line. White can capture on c6, that's a different story though. Knight comes to f6, white castles. Bishop comes to e7. Rook comes to e1, defending the e-pawn. This is the so-called main line of the Ruy Lopez. The pawn comes to b5, attacking the bishop, which retreats to b3. Pawn to d6, supporting the centre pawn. Pawn comes to c3, preparing pawn to d4, establishing a strong centre. Black castles. And now it's possible to play the pawn to d4 immediately, but most people play pawn to h3, preventing black's bishop coming to g4. Knight comes to a5, attacking the bishop. Bishop retreats to c2. Pawn comes to c5. And white finally plays pawn to d4. This is really the starting position of the Ruy Lopez, the main line. It's called Chigorin's defense. I want to look at the game Fischer against Keres from the Curacao Candidates Tournament in 1962. This is a beautiful game from Bobby Fischer. Keres now played a slightly unusual move, which I think was his own invention. He played his knight back to d7 to support the pawn on e5. And Fischer played very classically. He captured the pawn on c5. Keres recaptured with the pawn. Now take a look at this position. Think, how are you going to best develop white's queenside pieces? The pawn structure is reasonably fixed, so we can speak in terms of piece manoeuvring here without worrying too much that it's going to suddenly change. Here white has two outposts that he might be able to make use of, one on d5 and one on f5. The f5 square can be covered sometimes by the pawn coming to g6, but the d5 square is really unprotected. The pawn has come up to c5. Now, although these black queenside pawns look impressive, in fact that can be a serious weakness. If the pawn were back on c6, then it would mean that an invasion of the d5 square could be prevented. But on c5, the d5 square is an enormous hole. Here Fischer embarked on the classic Spanish manoeuvre of bringing the knight on b1 on the queen side round via f1 to e3, looking at that outpost on d5. He played the knight to d2. Queen c7 occurred, and the knight came round to f1. Keres played the knight to b6. He wants to cover the d5 square, but Fischer continued. He played the knight to e3. Now that is such a beautiful square for the knight, because it's looking not only at d5 but also f5 as well, which could be very dangerous near to black's king. Keres played the rook to d8, attacking the queen, which came to e2. And Keres brought the bishop to e6. Now he is trying to cover the d5 square. Now Fischer here, he's manoeuvred the knight to e3, this beautiful square. Now he could play it into f5, but then the bishop might just retreat to f8, and the black king is totally protected there. Instead, Fischer launched the knight into d5 straight away. Obviously, Keres captured. Fischer recaptured with the pawn. And came bishop takes d5. And this is the point. Fischer recaptured his pawn with knight takes e5. Now the point of this little transaction was to open up the line of the bishop on c2 down towards black's king. The bishop is looking at that pawn on h7, and suddenly Keres's king side is looking a little bit weak, and Fischer was able to exploit this. I'll just play over the next few moves just very quickly to show how the attack developed, but the main point is that this attack would not have happened if Fischer hadn't played this wonderful manoeuvre, getting knight from b1 round to d5. Just quickly then, Keres played the rook to a7 to cover the bishop on e7. Bishop came to f4, looking at black's queen. You can see how Fischer's initiative is developing so rapidly. So the queen moved out of the way to b6. Then the rook came across to d1. Black pawn came to g6. Really had to shut that diagonal off. The bishop on c2 was too powerful. Knight g4. Looking at those weak squares on the king side. Knight c4. Bishop h6. Now this is very dangerous. Black's king is looking really constricted. There are problems with the back rank. It's pretty horrific. Bishop came to e6. Bishop b3. Queen to b8. And now Fischer actually won a pawn by rook takes rook. Bishop takes rook. Bishop takes knight on c4. Pawn takes bishop. And queen takes c4. Of course, if bishop takes queen, then rook e8 is mate. At first sight, these manoeuvres might seem sophisticated, but if you see them once, then they'll begin to crop up in your own games, and the idea of targeting a square won't seem so mysterious.